Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Yankee and Canuck podcast, a show where we discuss TV, film, and more.
And I'm your host, a Yankee.
And I'm your host, Canuck.
And today we're going to be talking about All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930 Best Picture winner, the third Best Picture winner, actually.
And this is a pre-code anti-war film based off the novel of the same name. It centers around the story of Paul and his classmates who've enlisted in the German military to serve during World War One. Soon their glorified, romanticized ideas of war are shattered almost immediately when they're sent to the front lines.
So yeah, this was a pretty good film overall. I ended up seeing a crappy version of the film. It looked like it was falling apart. That's how I first saw it. And then I thought, oh, there's a version on Netflix. It's a 2022 version. I might as well see that. Why not? So I saw that. And then somewhere down the line, people were like, oh, there's a 1979 version. Huh? I might as well see that too. So I saw that. And then in preparation for this podcast, I decided to see it one more time. And it was a more beautifully restored version of the original 1930 movie. And on top of all that, I read the book. And yeah, I got to say, man, I'm all quiet on the Western fronted out as far as I'm concerned. I say all in all, it's a pretty harrowing tale of war. You know, I don't know much about World War One. You know, I'm an American. We're not taught about that. We're just told about how awesome we are during World War Two. but
Right.
but of course, you know, this came out way before World War II even started. And interesting thing about this particular film too, around this time when this film came out, 1930, that's when the Nazi Party was coming into prominence. So I thought it was pretty ironic that while this film was released and being celebrated as, you know, a pretty excellent portrayal of war, particularly about German soldiers going out and fighting this war very valiantly and courageously, Nazi Germany would soon rise to prominence and cause like a whole host of films to come in its wake about how much we kicked their asses in World War II.
Oh yeah, definitely. Hitler was elected chancellor and took power in 33, and the Nazi Party was already formed in the 20s, in the early 20s, and but they already slowly got more and more power and influence. When this book and movie came out, the Nazi Party was already causing problems. They were harassing and picketing the theaters. I think they were throwing like smoke grenades in the theater to deter people from watching it. And
That's
so,
crazy. That is so
yeah.
crazy. I 100% believe it. I believe they tried to ban this book too, or they tried to burn it. And
It was, yeah, yeah. As soon as they got into power, they banned the book. There was book burnings. I mean, they banned, obviously so many books and had book barbecues, if you will. And and
book barbecues, they put them on a Barbie.
yeah, even before Hitler took power in 33, they ended up editing the film heavily, right? And then they re-released that edited version, from what I gathered.
Yeah, there was a disclaimer, something to that effect, that the film was edited at some point. I wouldn't doubt that that's what happened.
Yeah, but then by 33 or something, it was just completely outlawed.
Yeah, so it's kind of a miracle in the sense that this film survived in this, you know, iteration. Even the book survived. Yeah, but yeah, if anything, it is pretty faithful to the book. Interestingly enough, the scene in the book that it opens with is actually the scene in which the soldiers are being fed. The cook has cooked for like a group of 150, but there are only 80 men. It's interesting how that's how the book opens up, but in the movie that doesn't happen until about like what, roughly 40 minutes into it, 50 minutes into it.
Yeah, something like that.
So it takes a while to get to that part, which makes sense in terms of the film because you have to ease into it. And in the book, it kind of jumps around here and there, so it's kind of like a non-traditional way of telling that story.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of the film itself, it opens up with, you know, a bunch of doors open up, you see the streets, and you see a bunch of soldiers marching around. You see one of the main characters, Himmeltoss, who at this point he's like a postmaster of some kind. He's like a post
Yeah, he's the
officer.
mailman.
And then after that, you know, you cut into the classroom, and that's where you're going to meet more of the principal main characters, including Paul. And you have this teacher saying a bunch of jingoistic nonsense about how it's valiant to fight and die for the fatherland and all that stuff, you know. And all the young kids in the classroom are all like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let me enlist. And of course, the mothers, they cut to one of them going home with the uniform. And the mother is like horrified, like, are you sure you want to do this? And he's like, yeah, what's wrong? I'm fighting for the fatherland. I'm like, yeah, you kids have no idea what you're getting yourselves into.
At the same time, it seems everyone has the opinion that the war will be over real quick, right? They're like, the Russians are already being defeated. The French will be defeated any day now. Like, they have no idea.
It's kind of like a big foreshadowing, and for anyone who's like ignorant to how war works, especially at that point, it's a pretty good introduction as to how messed up things are going to be later on in the film. Shortly after that, they go to boot camp, and Himmeltoss, now he's the drill sergeant to these young kids, and the kids are like, "Oh, look, it's the post guy, ha ha ha!" But then, being in a higher rank compared to the other soldiers, he's immediately like, "Hey, get in line. I'm gonna work you through this, and you're gonna be men by the time you're done." So he puts him through the ringer, making him do all kinds of exercises and drills to the point where the boys are like, you know what, this guy, we're gonna jump him, we're gonna spank him and throw him in a
Yeah.
puddle, like a mud puddle, and we're like, that's pretty funny.
And I know in the there's different versions slightly of events with the three different films, right? And in this 1931 is a little bit more straightforward. I remember in the 79 version, it's a little bit different where even before they go to war, they see him in the street, right? And he's delivering mail or whatever, and they kind of pester him. They take his hat from him and go, nah, 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 nah. And I think they knock his mail out of his hand. And so, it's they're kind of being, punks to him, to be honest. The only difference is he takes that and once he finds out he's in charge of this training regiment, he just
Exactly.
becomes a complete asshole and he's a power tripping and he knows this is the way he gets his revenge and he just escalates it
Yeah,
more and more. And
he just
maybe the same.
yeah, he just straight up exacts his revenge on these kids.
Yeah, and he goes way too far, man. Like, talk about escalation. But the 1930 version didn't quite have that same scene. They're just not really showing him the respect, and that's partly because they know him. He's from their hometown. He's their mailman. They probably see him all the time. They're young and they're not quite aware of the chain of command, and they gotta show him respect or whatever. But
Yeah,
they don't do anything really nefarious or anything. But he just takes it a certain way, and
it's an
yeah.
interesting scene. It's definitely in the book as well. Yeah, I feel like in the 1979 version, just to quickly touch on it, Himmeltoss is actually given a full arc, and he's given a
Mm.
lot more screen time, and you get to feel him more as a character. In the book, he's touched on here and there, but he just kind of disappears after a while. He's not referenced anymore. And the same sort of thing happens to him in the 1930s version. He gets a little bit of screen time. You see him a little bit in the boot camp as well. And then you only see him pretty much one more time, maybe a couple more times, but one more time prominently when he's in war and he's like cowering in the trenches. And like one of the characters, I believe it's Paul, or one of the characters is just like, "Hey, you coward, you better get out there." And then he's like, "Ah!" Himmeltoss finally, gets his shit together and he goes like, "Ah, war, ah!" And there's an explosion and then he just falls. And then you just don't see him anymore after that. And the assumption is he dies in battle, but it's not made explicit.
Okay, yeah, I assumed he actually died there. Basically, I think it was like you said. I think it was Paul. Slaps the shit out of him, and he's like, stop being a coward, get up there, and he
Yeah.
charges with them. And from my understanding, he gets gunned down, gets shot, and
There's a
that's what I
there's like
that's what I thought.
an explosion that happens and then he just kind of falls down. So
Oh, okay,
that's
yeah,
like that's kind of like pretty much the only time you see him as far as I'm aware.
yeah,
So, yeah. And in the book,
different,
the book
yeah,
doesn't mention him anymore. So, it's just assumed that he's probably dead or lost in war, MIA as they say. So, it's just like you don't know what happens to that guy. In
yeah,
this in the 79 version, you actually know what happens to him. I'm not going to say it cuz we're not going to talk about that film right now, but you know what happens to him there. But
yeah. He's got a lot more scenes in that movie, a lot more.
he's pretty much a prominent character. And in the 22 version, he's not mentioned at all. They just excise that character entirely. But anyway, back to the 1930 version, and there's a lot of interesting scenes. It's mostly about the camaraderie between these young kids and an older soldier called Stanislaus Kaczynski, but they call him Cat for short, obviously. And he's a seasoned vet. He's seen some and he has like some pretty interesting quotes in the film. One of them is which when one of the classmates ends up getting gunned down after he's blinded after a big bombing attack. The other students come in, pull him in, and Cat's like, "What are you doing that for? He's our friend." And Cat's all like, "Well, he's a corpse." I'm like, "Damn, bro." I mean,
Yeah,
you're not wrong, but Jesus Christ. Um, yeah, and then later on in the film too, another student is like trying to learn some like physics or some geometry or something like that, and he's like, "Hey, isn't that interesting?" And then Cat's like, "What good is that? One day you'll stop a bullet and it's all gonna be for nothing." And I'm like, "Bro, this dude is so nihilistic." It's so
yeah.
crazy.
He's also probably about twice their age, but you see, he's portrayed. He's brave, he's crafty, and cunning, but he's also funny too. So
Very much so. The actor was Louis Wellheim, and he was actually older than the other actors, appropriately so, and he actually died a year after the film came out.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He died of ostensibly stomach cancer, is what it was reported as. And he was 50 years old when he died. So he's probably around 48, 49 when they did the film. So it was a pretty interesting way for him to end his career that way. The movie's actually centered around Paul Balmer, who's played by Lou Ayres, and he plays it pretty well. Obviously, he's the main central character in the book and in this movie, so you get to see a lot of how horrible war is through his perspective. He goes from being this bright young kid and just transforms all the way to the end to like such a hardened soldier who's seen so much shit, and he's just like, man, I can't wait to die, which is really sad, but unfortunately it is a commentary of how an actual soldier would feel in this situation. One thing I forgot to mention in the very beginning is the jingoism and the classroom. So the jingoism in the classroom is pretty disgusting, but unfortunately that's just like how you get these young kids to sign up for war thinking that they're going for a great cause. But ultimately, through all versions of this film and the original book, the whole theme of the entire thing is anti-war. It's to show you how young kids are indoctrinated, how they're thrusted into this situation thinking that they're doing a good cause, but in reality they're just pawns by the rich that rule over them to send these poor little proletariat kids out to war and just to die, and if not to die, to suffer horrifically, to get gangrene, to get their legs cut off, their arms cut off, to suffocate through mustard gas, to suffer in trenches with stale pieces of bread, with rats coming in to eat whatever rations they have left. It's ridiculous. It's horrifying. And it's interesting that they do have this kind of elongated scene at the end where Paul comes back and he's just like, yeah, this is all bullshit, kids. Don't fall for this. And the kids are like, you're a coward, you're a coward, you're a traitor. Get him, off with his head. Off with his head. Fuck this guy. And it's just like, guys, he's been through war. He's trying to tell you it's all a sham, but that's the point, and that point has not been lost in any version of the film. And interestingly enough, Lou Ayres, who plays Paul, after he was cast in this role, he became very anti-war. They interviewed him a year before his death, and the interviewer asked him, hey, was it because of this film that you were anti-war? And at this point, he was like an 87-year-old man, so he was just kind of collecting his thoughts. But he said, the film probably solidified my stance even further, to the point where in World War II, he was just like, yeah, man, listen, I don't want to fight in this war. And people at that time were calling him a coward. So he had to make arrangements with the U.S. Army to be like, listen, I can be in the med unit, but I do not want to fight in war. This is not what I want to do. So he ended up serving, but, as a medical technician. And then he ended up coming back to Hollywood. He thought his anti-war position would end up causing him to get blacklisted in Hollywood, but he ended up having a pretty decent career all the way to the end of his life.
I always think about that scene with the butterfly, of course at the end, but how it connects to the scene where he goes back home. Remember when he's on leave? And you see his bug collection on the wall right at home when he's with his sister.
Yeah.
And the butterfly out there in the middle of the death zone, life surrounded by death, possibly reminding him of his youth when he still had his innocence and his humanity, which obviously the war has taken from him.
Literally, by the end, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very powerful scene, I agree, and it's something that resonates with me even to this day, having seen it especially 4 times. More times than I ever thought I would see the film, but it is a good film ultimately. Other notable scenes in the film are the famous ration scene. You had the cook there who cooked for 150 men, but at that point in the film, it's about 50 minutes into the film, there are only 80 of them, and the cook is like, well, I cooked for 150, and then a cat comes in and he's just like, yo, man, this is all you got. You got to feed us, Yeah. It is a scene that's in all versions of the film, and especially from the book, as I mentioned in the very beginning of the book.
That scene itself is definitely one of the lighter scenes in the entire film. However, I still find it sad because while they're there finally getting a hot meal after they've already been on the front lines and they already lost one of their friends, and
yeah, they've lost a lot of people at that point, and that's when they were just like, you know what, man, they ain't gonna come. We need to eat.
Yeah, exactly. I always find it kind of sad because they don't really take a moment to think about the reasoning why they're getting double portions, And then, of course, they're aware of it because they were there. They know the reason. I find it, really sad that, hey, we made food for 150 people. Oh, we're getting double portions then because Well, half of them are dead, right? So, but that being said, the amount of beans they're eating, let's, come on, man. It's about to be not so quiet on the Western Front. You know what I mean. I mean, instead of the cowboy scene in Blazing Saddles with by the campfire, it's going to be soldiers by the campfire, just
Yes,
farting up a storm, man.
absolutely. It's not only going to be quiet, it's definitely going to be very stinky. I mean, mustard gas? Try to talk about bean
Yeah,
gas instead in those trenches.
right. Yeah, well, they got the gas masks at least.
They're all set. They're going to be
Yeah.
fine. Speaking of the trenches, too, I mean, they do spend a little bit of time in this movie in the trenches, and there's a scene where one of the soldiers tries to get out because they're claustrophobic, and they're just like, I want to get out, I want to get out, and then one of the soldiers gets killed, ultimately. Interestingly enough, we spent a lot of more time in the trenches in the original book, but there is a scene that's in the book, and it's not really fully explored in any of the films, especially the latest one, the 22 version. There is a scene in the 1930 version and the 1979 version where it deals with a bunch of rats coming in and stealing their rations.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, in the book, there's actually a really good chapter, and I'm actually a little bit disappointed it's not properly adapted. I understand the logistics behind it would be too complicated to do, even back then. But in the original book, my favorite chapter is when they're in the trenches and they have these stale pieces of bread that they gotta eat, right? And they have it hanging around, and then all of a sudden, all these big ass rats come in and start eating their stuff. And they call them corpse rats because, of course, the rats are so big and fat because they're eating off the corpses of fallen men. At one point in the book, they decide to hang their stale pieces of bread on a line in the ceiling. So they're like, okay, there's no way these rats can get to our pieces of bread. But the rats are pretty cunning, according to the book, and they're able to jump up and get their pieces of bread from the string. And so they're running out of food, and they're just like, you know what? These rats, we got to get them. So they end up coming up with this plan where they get a bunch of rations, I believe, and they scatter them around. They get their spades and they get their bayonets, and they're just waiting for these rats to come in. And once the rats come in, they just go fucking ape, and they're just killing them left and right. And to a point where the rats end up realizing, okay, let's just back off. These humans are dangerous. They're going to kill us. And their food rations were safe after a while. But of course, the rats end up coming back, and it becomes another problem for them. And that there's a whole chapter that's dedicated to that. And I'm like, I love that. And I wish it was properly adapted in any of the movies, especially the latest one. But alas, it's not to be.
I do want to note that this film was directed by Louis Milestone, who also won the Best Director award that year. He's well known for directing Mutiny on the Bounty, the 60s version, not the 30s one. It was actually his last film he did. It has Marlon Brando in it, Richard Harris. It's a good film. Had a lot of problems, but I like the 30s one with Clark Gable and Charles Lofton a lot more. But he also directed Of Mice and Men with Lon Chaney Jr., Ocean's 11. He was a very acclaimed director at the time and won multiple awards, multiple Best Director awards. So, this movie, I think, had multiple runs in the theaters because it was banned and then repurposed. And one of the versions, I think, was missing 20 or 30 minutes. That might be the original version, or the only version we've seen is actually missing 20 minutes or so. I'm not aware of what that 20 minutes lost was. Maybe it was a scene from the novel that you read. I'm not entirely sure.
Who knows? I mean, this film was very faithful to the novel, so it's very possible that, it probably was a scene from the book or something.
I think even the author of the novel, his name was what, Eric Remarque. He was born Erich Remarque, but he changed his name because his ancestors were actually French. The author, he's from Germany, of course, but his ancestors were French. And I guess when he wrote that novel, I read that he changed his name back to Eric Marie Remarque, and that
Right.
was the name he used to have. But he was born Eric Remarque.
Got it. All right. Well, that puts a pretty interesting perspective on this whole thing, since the Germans were also mostly fighting the French in all versions of this film in the book. The best thing about the film, though, I think overall, are the battle scenes. The war scenes are absolutely amazing compared to Wings, which is also a World War One film, mostly focusing on aviation. But in this film, it's trench warfare. You go through the field, and you have soldiers just running, copious amounts of soldiers just running through the battlefield, explosions going off left and right. There are three particular battle scenes that are played in this film. And one of the scenes, this is the third one that's played towards the end of the film, where the German soldiers are just walking, and all of a sudden they're just bombarded by bombs that are just falling, and buildings are exploding, and all these soldiers are scattering around. And I'm like, wow, this is amazing! Like the amount of extras that are on set, the amount of choreography, just getting the soldiers to fall, in certain spots and things like that. It's just absolutely amazing what they're able to do. And there's a really cool scene too with a gunner where the German soldiers are just gunning down these French soldiers, and then there's this tracking shot going left and right, and all these soldiers are just falling, left and right. It's just crazy what they were able to do.
Totally agree, man. The production was amazing. Wings was a good film. This is a great film. I mean,
Yeah,
that's the best way I would put it.
I agree.
The cinematography, the production, just it's really great, man. World War One was called the Great War, and this is really a great film about it. I mean, it's a film that has a story worth telling, man. It's grounded in the realities of war. As you mentioned earlier, it definitely leaves you with an impression. You don't really need to watch it more than once. I know, I know you watched it a few times, and
Oh
of course,
yeah.
I watched the other versions as well. But this one I only watched once. I don't feel you need to watch it more than once because it'll make you think, it'll make you feel, you'll reflect on it. It doesn't pull any punches, and it's profoundly moving and powerful. You definitely should watch it. I mean, I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you're a fan of film and not watching this.
So, Canuck, what rating would you give out of a 10?
Oh, definitely an 8.3 for sure. I think it's a fantastic film.
Yeah, for me, it's an amazing film through and through. It's very well put together. It's a great production, a lot of great performances. There are times where I felt like it was pretty slow. The battle scenes are great. Sometimes they went on a little bit too long. There are scenes such as, like the soldiers going in to get laid by the French girls, giving them food and things like that. Those are nice little scenes. I felt like they could have been shortened a little bit more. So even though this is a great film through and through and is groundbreaking for its time, I would have to give it a 7.5 only because of those reasons. If it was cut short a little bit more and it wasn't jumping around so much throughout the narrative, I would probably give it a higher rating. And also it's tainted by the fact that I've seen the 79 version and the 22 version. And while the 22 version is nothing really like the book or any of the other previous versions, it is a pretty intense version of what World War One was like. And it just was just like horrifying.
Yeah, the 22 version was a great film too.
Out of all the versions I've seen, the 79 version to me is the best one because of, you get into more depth of some of the characters. It's more succinct. You get more to the point a lot quicker, and it still follows the book more or less. But the 30s version is the classic one. It did win the best picture, and it's still a great film regardless. So I give it a 7.5. All right, so stay tuned, guys. We're going to be talking about the fourth Best Picture winner, which is the first Western, I believe, that won Best Picture. So stay tuned for that, and we'll be seeing you next time.
That's right. Peace, not war.